The normal answer, which is the IMF's answer, is that China is now accounting for about 30% of global GDP growth, and that number has been rising with the size of China's economy. That answer is pretty much wrong. And the reason is they're using average GDP growth to talk about a contribution. China does raise the average of global GDP growth, no question about it. But in terms of its contribution to the rest of the world's GDP, that comes through its trade balance. And China runs a huge trade surplus, which means that it's taking GDP away from the rest of the world. So in fact, for the past 10, 11, 12 years, China has been taking the most GDP away from the rest of the world. It is driving down world GDP growth more than any other country. Completely the opposite of what the IMF and others would say about China raising average global GDP growth. There's a better way to look at this than through GDP, which is what we really care about, is how people are doing around the world, their incomes, your income, my income, the income of someone in Brazil, whereas GDP is an accounting tool. And there was a really big change when the financial crisis hit. Before the financial crisis, the world was in a period of excess demand. We were booming, we couldn't keep up with demand, we had inflationary pressures, and China really helped the world out by producing more. We were able to have a long period of growth globally for more than 15 years without inflation, and China was the most important reason for that in terms of keeping prices down. When the financial crisis hit, which was not China's fault, we shifted and we're still in a period of excess supply, which means we have too much capacity. We produce too much, we don't have enough demand. This is what countries are struggling with all over the world in terms of loose monetary policy. And now, even though the financial crisis wasn't China's fault, China's actually hurting the rest of the world because China has the most excess capacity of any country. So they're the leader, but they're the leader in something we have too much of and we don't want. In a better way of framing things than GDP, China used to contribute a great deal to the world economy through most of the 2000s. Now it's harming the world economy. Well, there are a lot of ways. The one that's been obvious in the last few years is commodities. China is the world leading consumer of imported oil, of iron ore, of copper, of a lot of foodstuffs like soybeans. So they are the major determinant of prices. When we had a commodities boom, we had what's called the commodities super cycle. Commodities prices kept going up and up and up. And commodities veterans would say, well, when are we going to get the downturn? We're always supposed to have a downturn. And the reason we didn't get it is because of China. China just kept forcing up these prices with its demand. And we had years and years and years of rising energy, rising food, and rising metals prices. And now that's all flipped, showing China can work its magic, depending on whether you want high or low commodities prices, the other direction. Chinese demand for metals, none of these are all strong, they're just not growing nearly as fast as they used to. And that's been the #1 reason for why commodities prices, energy and metals especially, have tanked. That we've not seen the growth out of China that we had before. So you have this huge impact of China on the world's commodities producers. Russia, Venezuela, Australia, the oil producers in the Middle East, you name it. The other way China impacts the world is they're the end of the supply chain for consumer electronics and to some extent clothing. So there's these very complicated supply chains that start in many cases in the US. They run through countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and they end up with China assembling our phones, China assembling our computers. And that they are a massive supplier of labor to the world, as everybody knows, Chinese workers. But the specific way they matter now is creating the consumer electronics boom. The reason our consumer electronics are so cheap, not the only reason, one of the main reasons our consumer electronics are so cheap is because China's at the end of that supply chain. If we assembled those phones in the United States, the price would go way up, demand would go way down, and the whole industry would be much less, the size would be smaller, but also be much less innovative. So that's another big effect of China. That's been very positive through most of China's rise. Those are the reason we're talking about trade is because that's how it affects we're talking about the effect on the rest of the world rather than China's economy. The other effect that hasn't gotten as much attention until recently is China's investment. So China used to basically just buy US bonds. That was its investment overseas. They would buy treasuries, dump their money there. We'd have these silly debates in the United States over that. It never meant anything. It was just a way to store their trade surpluses. Now, however, you see rising by double figures year after year, past $100 billion annually now, China investing in other assets. A lot in the United States, but not bonds. They invest in companies overseas. They invest in oil fields to some extent overseas, although that's declining. They try to buy technology. They try to buy farms. So we've always focused on trade for good reason. Trade has been dominant in China's effects in the world on commodities prices in supply chains. Investment is now coming to the fore. And as China's trade stagnates to some extent, I think investment's going to be the story the next few years. Well, it works both ways. The Chinese really suffered as oil prices rose because they're the biggest oil importer for the last few years, and now they're really benefiting as oil prices drop. So it's not that China causes oil or oil causes China. There's a circle here where it could start with the U.S. shale boom drives oil prices down, and that really benefits China. But on the flip side, if China's economy slows down, which is completely independent of the U.S. shale boom, it hits the oil market. So they're affected by commodities. They're very much affected by food prices, which we haven't, thankfully, seen a lot of instability in. But China's the biggest food importer by far, and that changes their inflation rates a great deal. The country is very sensitive to inflation rates. They're affected by the global demand shift that we saw in 2007 and 2008. China set up its economy essentially for global demand to provide Chinese jobs. That there was a lot of global demand and China needed a lot of employment, and they set their economy up for those jobs to sell to the global marketplace. The global marketplace has stagnated, demand has stagnated, and China thus has to figure out different ways to keep people employed. And what they've done is gone on a debt-funded investment boom with very little return that has put their economy in very bad shape. So you see that the initial effect there really came from the global shock. China chose an unwise response, but it comes from the global shock. The Chinese realize they have to reorient their economy, and they mess it up. This is a great question, and I have a very particular answer that I think will become more and more important over time. The Chinese are now really touting the Belt and Road Initiative, where they cooperate with all these countries, and it's a really big belt and a really big road because it seems to be wrapped around most of the planet. They're going to cooperate with lots of countries. They're going to build infrastructure. They're going to lend them money. There are going to be Chinese companies involved. And the Chinese do a lot of construction overseas. I follow that in our China Global Investment Tracker. They have $100 million contracts last year with more than 40 countries. So they're really spread already, and they want to do more. That's all dependent on having this huge pile of cash. The reason the Chinese can fund the Belt and Road Initiative, the reason they gave money to the Asia Infrastructure Bank, the reason they gave money to the BRICS Bank, the reason their companies are competitive in these projects is a very low-cost financing out of their foreign exchange reserves, which peaked at over $4 trillion. Well, they dropped $600 billion last year. So that huge pile of cash, which we have all taken for granted, certainly including me and other China watchers, which was behind this expansion of China's construction and investment, which is a huge part of their foreign policy goals, that's in question. You could see in a couple of years, if trends continue, China says, well, of course we want to work with our foreign partners. Our goals are not changed at all. But we need more help from our partners than we've been getting in the last few years. That the image of China coming to you with money to offer that dominates so many Chinese visits around the world and visits to China, that there's business to be had, that could be replaced by a more normal country that doesn't have this huge pile of money to offer because they've suffered so much capital flight because of their domestic economic deterioration. I'm sort of beating a dead horse here, but that changes again in 2007, 2008. It doesn't change immediately because China had stimulus, which kept its demand for imports high, but it's changed by now. Chinese imports demand fell by double digits in 2015. In the time when Chinese import demand was voracious, it was actually the suppliers that had the control. The Chinese, for example, got extremely mad at the biggest iron ore producers in the world and tried to coerce them into fixed prices, and the iron ore producers said no. Said, go ahead, try to boycott us. You can't do it. And they couldn't. And so we had a period, 2004 all the way through 2010, where the Chinese were huge importers and all the commodity suppliers had more power in the market relationship than they did because the Chinese couldn't stop importing. Now that their imports have weakened, especially this year, it's all flipped. Now, commodity suppliers are desperate for customers. China's still the biggest customer, even though its import demand has weakened. And now the Chinese have a great deal of influence over these countries, saying, are you sure you want us to stop buying your oil, your copper, your wheat? And they've exercised it. So oddly, in this period of a weak Chinese economy, that's essentially boosted their influence over some of these countries, because before China was perceived as needing all of these things that other countries were making. Now it's more of a luxury, and you better stay on our good side if you want us to continue buying from you.